Hello, everyone. My name is Guy Lancaster. I serve as editor of the online Encyclopedia of Arkansas, which is based in the Bobby L. Roberts Library for Arkansas History and Art in downtown Little Rock. Across Rock Street from Main Library, the Roberts Library houses the galleries at Library Square and the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. During the pandemic, the Central Arkansas Library System, of which we are a part, is offering through its branches curbside service for patrons to pick up their library materials, and you can use our Ask a Librarian or Ask a Genealogist service to get your research questions answered via phone or email. Branches are now allowing a limited number of patrons into their buildings by appointment to use computers, fax items, or perform other services. For more details about all these services, go to cals.org. You can even visit the Roberts Library by appointment now. The Roberts Library Research Room and the galleries at Library Square will be open on a limited basis Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 9 to 11 a.m. and 1 to 5 p.m. The 9 to 11 time slot will be set aside exclusively for high-risk populations. During these hours, both the galleries and the research room will take appointments and allow a very limited number of walk-up visitors. For more information, go to robertslibrary.org. And of course, we're doing a lot of virtual programming during this pandemic. This includes story times, cooking classes, craft activities, and podcasts. You can find most of these programs archived on CAL's YouTube channel. Just go to youtube.com and search for the Central Arkansas Library System. Subscribe to the channel to get notification when the latest videos are posted. And follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to fill your feed with fun and interesting educational content. One of the things we're doing at Roberts Library right now is collecting your stories, photographs, and art related to the COVID-19 pandemic experiences of Arkansans. We did a similar collecting initiative last year during the Arkansas River flood. Please go to robertslibrary.org for more information or to submit your photographs and stories. We want to hear from you. Your story is important to Arkansas history. Now to this evening's program titled National Healthcare Community, Hot Springs National Park, Arkansas, 1921 to 1936, with Janis K. Percefull. Janis K. Percefull is a historian, author, educator, and public speaker. She earned a BA in history at Ouachita Baptist University and a master's in public history from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. As a graduate student, she was awarded the UAMS History of Medicine Research Award in 2001 and won the UALR Gender Studies Research Paper Contest in 2003. She's currently based in Hot Springs and has researched that community extensively. If you have any questions, feel free to add them into the chat on Zoom anytime during the talk, and we will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. This is also being broadcast on YouTube, but please don't leave any questions there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janis Percefull. All yours, Janis.
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I'm going to, let's see. I'm assuming we're starting now. Okay. If tomorrow morning you found out that you were going there was going to be a change in the superintendent of Hot Springs National Park, and the person that was going to be the superintendent was going to be a medical doctor, you would probably be surprised, and you might even question, why is that happening? Something like that really did happen in 1914. A man by the name of William P. Parks became the superintendent. He was a physician in Mena, and he was also part of the newly formed Arkansas Board of Health. From 1914 to 1932, the superintendents of Hot Springs National Park all came from the United States Public Health Service. I'm going to be answering two questions tonight. one of the questions is what kind of activities did the public health do here in Hot Springs, and why did the people in the early part of the 20th century, why did they embrace these activities? To answer that question, I'm going to give an overview of the rise of public health in the United States, and as focusing it on the relationship to Hot Springs, and talking about a particular disease, which was the disease syphilis, and trying to do a little comparison between COVID-19 today and what is happening with the public health today. The rise of public health in the United States, the development, had a mission that emphasized avoidance and later prevention and not treatment. Also, the military culture and commercial interests greatly influenced or dominated the public health. Syphilis was a centuries-old disease that could lay dormant for years. And even though COVID is a new disease, there's some similarities. They can affect more than one vital organ. They can have multiple symptoms or no symptoms. Because of the damage they can do to you, you can have long-term health problems. But most importantly, syphilis at the beginning of the 20th century is like COVID today, no vaccine and no definitive cure. Now, in the beginning of the 19th century, the way people thought about disease was called the miasmic. Before the advent of the germ theory, you had the miasmic theory. And the miasmic theory was the idea that all rotting matter, vegetation and everything that was decomposing, that you would have diseases forming in this rotting matter, and that it would be lifted up on the mist and the fog. Also, at the beginning of the 19th century, the way that the medical community dealt with diseases was called purging. It made sense. If your body had disease, you wanted to purge it, take it out. And so they would give these really harsh medicines, concoctions that would induce vomiting, diarrhea. The bloodletting was quite popular also. And the further you got along in the 19th century, with each year, it seemed like they did greater and greater doses. It was like if you did a little bit, more was better. And so it got to be known as the era of heroic medicine because of the heroic doses that were being given people. One of the more common medicines they gave, it was called calomel, and it was a mercury compound. And mercury actually was specific for syphilis. And so that was continued, mercury treatments, until into the 20th century. And in 1940, they came up with penicillin, actually 38, 39, penicillin. And actually Hot Springs was one of the first places to use penicillin. Let's see. So there was also, at the same time you had heroic medicine, you had the beginnings of something called the water cure. And the further into the century we got, as people started running away from heroic medicine, they started to run toward the water cure. And by the 1930s, the 1830s, the water cure was already being practiced in Hot Springs area, and we were still a territory. uh, the we had the elements that were most cherished by the water cure, all except one. We had mountain air and the thermal waters and the cold waters, and specifically sulfur and iron water, spring water. The one thing we didn't have was ocean or sea air. There were also two other spring regions besides the Ouachita Springs region that you saw the water cure developing in these areas too. One was New York and the other was Virginia. Now, in the 19th century, with the heroic medicine and the water cure, you had several incidents to happen, several events that actually helped the spread of syphilis. If you think about the waterways as being the highways of the early 19th century and before, we were blessed in this country with quite a number of waterways, and therefore we had a lot of port cities all along the Atlantic coast, down the Gulf, up the Mississippi to the Great Lakes, all the tributaries going into the Mississippi. So up in New York, some businessmen got the idea that would be a good idea to build canals and put all these waterways together. And so it was more of a project than they could handle. So they went to the federal government, and both Jefferson and then later Madison vetoed the idea. So the state of New York decided it was going to build the canal. And so they got started on the Erie Canal. And this was the 1820s. And then in the 1830s, you started having, and it all kind of overlapped, all these infrastructure projects. You had the railroads, and you also had mining. You had three gold rushes between 1820 and the time of the Civil War. You had all of this construction, this infrastructure, and the mining going on. And it was all very labor intensive. And so there were brothels, there were in the railroad towns and in the mining camps. In Buffalo, New York, you had a very famous place called Canal Street that was very famous for prostitutes. So you had the growth of prostitution, and you also had syphilis had help in getting spreaded, you might say, getting spread. So let's see. So you had all the ports, the port cities that transported goods, transported people, and it also was transporting diseases. And you had diseases like yellow fever and malaria and cholera. And you also had sexually transmitted diseases as well. In the 1830s, I keep saying 19, it's 18. In the 1830s, you had the US government took two steps toward national public health. They, first of all, they started building a series of marine hospitals in port cities. And in between 1831 and 1834, they were building a hospital in Charleston, South Carolina. And the people of Charleston, or the leadership, there was some backlash against it. They didn't like the idea. They thought the federal government was overstepping its authority. So there was a little pushback against the federal government. Also in 1832, the federal government decided to set aside out in the Arkansas Territory, to set aside the thermal waters of the Ouachita here in Hot Springs and surrounding area. And it was quite a bit of surrounding area. Well, there was pushback against that because Hot Springs had already established itself as a health resort. It was still regional, but a lot of people felt as if they owned part of and some part of the valley. And so that instituted a court battle that lasted until the 1870s. So from the 1830s to the 1870s, for all those decades, the Hot Springs Health Resort was before the public eye. And this helped to actually promote the thermal springs here. So by mid-century, you had people running away from the heroic medicine and running to the water cure. Then in the 1850s, another event took place, which greatly influenced the rise of public health in the United States, and that was the Crimean War. We were not in the Crimean War, but we sent observers. And this war was known for two things. First, it was known for the charge of the Light Brigade. And this was a failed military maneuver. The British soldiers were very excited they glamorized war. And so they were very excited about getting into the battle. So they decided to charge down this, it was a valley, but it was like a plain valley. And on either side, you had the Russian cannons, and they got caught in a crossfire. But the British, putting a good spin on it, Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote a very famous poem called Charge of the Light Brigade. And even into the 20th century, you had movies made about it, and it was school kids had to memorize the poem, and so that glamour was still there. And the generation that would soon fight the American Civil War, the young men, besides being bored at home with the chores on the farm or in the factory, it was all very glamorous to go off to war until they were actually there, and the gore of it replaced the glory of it. The other thing that, and really the more important thing that is we remember about the Crimean War is Florence Nightingale. Miss Nightingale and some nurses that she took with her. She went with the notion that sanitation and ventilation was a way of cutting down on disease and making the rate of recovery better for soldiers. And she took with her the new science of statistics. She was the first one to do this, taking the new science of statistics to the battlefield. And her work during the Crimean War brought public health to the national level, both forefront in national level, both in the United States and in Britain. Now, I wanted to read this about statistics because it's as pertinent today as it was back in the Crimean War. Statistics help in identifying the causes of disease, modes of transmission, appropriate control and prevention measures, and prioritizing and evaluating activities. Now, you would have thought that with the good work that was done in the Crimean War with the Sanitary Commission, that we would have created a Sanitary Commission at the beginning of the Civil War, but there was a resistance to it. And by the time the military personnel leadership had accepted that this might be a good thing, there were already many soldiers who had already been infected with diseases, had already died, and so there were long-term health issues, and of course syphilis remained unchecked. one of the things about the Civil War, that if you want to know the role of prostitution in the Civil War, the cities of Memphis and Nashville, Tennessee, they were Southern towns. So you had the Confederate soldiers there, and then they were taken over by the Union troops, and so you had Union troops there. And there's a whole big story there about how prostitution grew, and some of that had to do with poverty. Poverty causes prostitution. It is a cause of it. And you can readily see how a disease that you have soldiers on both sides being affected, then the war is over and they go home and their families, gets infected, and it just was allowed to go unchecked for decades. And after the Civil War, because both sides, because hot springs had been before the public eye for so long, people knew about hot springs, and so soldiers from both sides started filtering in to hot springs at the end of the war. By the 1870s, the court had decided in favor of the government, and so in 1878 the troops came into Hot Springs, and they were there for 3 years, and both commercial interests and the federal government started rebuilding the town with a more permanent infrastructure. The federal government overarched the creek that goes through Hot Springs, helped to lay sewer lines. They built the Army-Navy hospital complex and the government-free bathhouse and dispensary. And all of these were federally funded public health projects. Commercial interests, moreover, they used the federal government's involvement in Hot Springs in every way they could, any way and every way. They would say in big, bold letters that Hot Springs was owned, controlled, and endorsed by the United States government. So this just reinforced the idea that the federal government was already, or they were going to do significant public health facilities, because everything was pointing to that happening. During the time from after the Civil War to the turn of the century, you had corruption in government. You had people thinking that the government was owned by big business. And then along comes Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive era. And the progressives went after the corruption in government and the undue influence of big business. And so people started thinking that government could be a force for good. And in truth, there was a great deal of progress toward a better society at this time, but not for everyone, as we well know. And because the progressive era had a moral, gender, and racial bias component to it, some very bad decisions were made and unintended consequences happened. Now, with the Army-Navy hospital taking care of indigents from around the country, the personnel from the Army-Navy hospital, not the Army-Navy itself, but with the government-free bathhouse, and this is where things get all kind of murky. You had some of the personnel from the Army-Navy, but it was the government-free bathhouse on the reservation. And so it's understandable, again, how people more and more were thinking the federal government was sponsoring significant public health facilities. By the turn of the 20th century, the general application of decades of advancements in medicine and scientific technology, while it diminished the water cure, it never made it irrelevant. The idea at the turn of the century, there was a new wave of thinking about preventive medicine and about building up your own body to fight things off. That fresh air, sunshine, and exercise were good for keeping you healthy. And in Hot Springs, you can see in the older buildings, you see the skylights, the mountain trails they built at that time, and the gymnasiums. They built gymnasiums inside the bathhouses. If you ever have a chance to come to Hot Springs and go to the Fordyce Bathhouse Museum, it's on the third floor. There's a gymnasium up there. And what's neat about it is that they have the gym equipment that they had back at the turn of the century, which is a lot different. Some of it's a lot different than what you see today in gyms. In 1906, there was a test for syphilis called the Wassermann test. And at the time, people didn't realize, the medical community didn't realize there were a lot of false positives with it. And that caused some more than a little bit of problems. When World War I began in 1918, it was very alarming. And I forgot the percentage, but the percentage of young men being inducted into the military that had syphilis that came up positive, it was very alarming. And medical personnel met with General Pershing and convinced him that this needed to be addressed. And he got all on board with it. And in 1909, the government hired a medical director, and this medical director was employed to improve the operation of the free government bathhouse and also help supervise and really made way for modernizing the bathhouses. And he also paved the way for the government to start appointing medical doctors as the superintendent of the park. Today, with COVID-19, we're grappling with a lot of issues that deal with public health, from how to contain this disease to how to treat the patients who have it. Should we open our schools, our businesses? How do we do that? There's just a multiple of questions we don't have answers to, and we're all trying to feel our way through it. And at times, it's like the disease has gotten the better of us, and none of us knows exactly how it's going to end, but maybe we can learn something from the past. This concludes my presentation, and I again thank the Arkansas Encyclopedia, and I understand there's some questions, and somewhere there's
I'm back. Well, thank you very much. We do have a few questions. One of them is Hot Springs was rather off the beaten path, and as you were talking about, disease was often spread in port cities and railroad towns. So how much of Hot Springs isolation played into its reputation as a center of curing and healing?
Well, in 1850, one of the trains that came west came to the port of Memphis, and it stopped there, and then you could get on the ferry, come over, and it was, grant you, in 1850, it was, it was doable, but you had to get in a stagecoach and come from Little Rock here. For a long time, people had come up from New Orleans by the river. And there was even there was a paddle boat called the Dime that I guess it could turn on a dime, that came up from Arkadelphia. So yes, it was isolated, but people made their way here. Now in the 1870s, when the trains came into Hot Springs, that's when you really saw just trainloads. Plus the 1870s, that's when the court case was settled and things became more permanent. But people made their way here, not in as huge numbers, but it was a constant. There was constantly people here.
All right, but maybe was there the idea that, you know, it was away from all that city air, you know, you were talking about miasmas, you know, the
Right.
kind of.
There's that. The reputation grew quite a bit with that association of the federal government having such an interest in it.
Okay.
And that was a biggie right there.
Someone asks, and apparently you can't get away from this, did Al Capone come to Hot Springs for treatment?
I'm sure he did. Everybody came here for if he had syphilis, it's quite, you know, I don't know. I've never seen primary source material on it, but it's the thing about the gangster era. It was one small era, and the importance of Hot Springs is so much larger than that. It's we oh my goodness. I mean, I could go on just on the Army Navy Hospital alone. I mean, it was the major treatment center for polio for both civilian and military. That's one of the things about Hot Springs. You had like the Levi Hospital in association with the reservation, in association with the Army Navy Hospital, all working together, federally funded projects with private and local and federal. I mean, and it's so much bigger than just and I take nothing away from the era of gambling and shootouts and so forth.
But Hot Springs has a more robust history than what is often advertised.
Yes, and I guess it's what you're interested in, and we all tend to gravitate towards certain periods of history. I find the 19th century so fascinating because that was the century that I think you had two of the great revolutions of all time, which was the revolution of the harnessing of electricity and the development of the germ theory. Mm-hmm. Just think how that changed our thinking of the natural world, the very world we deal with every day, which I deal better, by the way, with the natural world than I do all of this computer. But I think I kind of got a hang of it toward the end. So anyway.
So someone asks, where were other similar hot spring (water cure) areas inside the U.S. beside Eureka Spring that had a similar draw for health or tourism purposes? Did the government also get involved with the development or promotion of those?
As far as I know, they didn't. It was hot springs primarily. The water cure needed the thermal springs. We just had the perfect setup here. You also in the Springs region of New York, and it escapes me some of the names. Am I there were several, Saratoga, there were several places, and then down in Virginia, and of course the Warm Springs, Warm Springs, Georgia. That was not as prominent as the Springs region in Virginia. And by the way, you find after the Civil War, Grant went to, I believe, Saratoga up in New York, and Lee visited the one of them down in Virginia. One of the things that was, and this harks back to being a little harder to get here. Once you got here, it was actually easier because our springs were, so much was all right in, and is all right in the valley. Whereas in New York and Virginia, their springs are spread out over miles. So that was advantageous for us.
Mm-hmm. And kind of put a lot of stuff within walking distance.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, I hadn't thought of that. Okay, someone asks, I think you assume everyone knows what the water cure is. Can you explain what it is, how it was used, and if in reality it was effective for anything?
Okay. How much time have we got? I didn't go into detail because I was trying to cover a whole lot. The water cure, and I'll try to make it short. The water cure started out as a cold water in Europe and came over here, and we started using warm water. And it was you drink the water, you sit in it for X number of minutes. You use a sheet, and they cover you. You use the it gets real hot and sweaty, and you drink cold water, and a lot of it, and it takes weeks. And it's about like, I mean, we talked today about, you know, chilling out and relaxing and this was like weeks of not having to worry about anything. Of course, how many people can do that? A lot of wealthy people partook of the water cure a lot back east. This was another advantage we had here, was that anybody could come here, and no matter if you had no money, some money, a lot of money. And we did. We had the wealthiest and the poorest people, and everybody in between to come here. Did it help? We use the word cure today, and they said water cure, but they talked a lot about healing instead of cure. We have, even to this day, a national arthritic hospital here, the Levi Arthritic Hospital. Arthritic people with arthritis, like some of us are getting, this helps. It doesn't cure, but it helps you. And I'm not science enough to explain all this. As far as syphilis goes, it didn't cure syphilis. The whole idea of coming to a place where there's thermal water, if you had syphilis, was, like I said, that mercury was specific for syphilis. So as you took this mercury, you really needed to take the water cure, the thermal baths and all that, because it helped to expel the mercury before it set up housekeeping. It's kind of like when you take chemotherapy today, they tell you, drink a lot of water, flush it out of your system. There are some things that you wouldn't want to come if you're, and here again, I'm not a doctor, but, and I better leave it at that. There are just some things you wouldn't want to come here for. But to me, logic, and there's a lot of logic in medicine, should be anyway. We have a problem today with toxins. Like years ago, the baseball players would come here to detox from alcohol. We have so many chemicals that we're ingesting, and my thinking is we would all benefit. I mean, everybody would benefit by taking the thermal baths. And they're very, I don't want to say ritualistic, but there's a pattern of what they do. And it's very, you know, you go in and then you so many minutes. So it's all kind of like it's been for years. I'm a believer in them in terms of detoxing. Let me put it that way. Did I answer that good enough for the person?
Sure.
Okay.
Do you think some of it too might have been a sense of community? Like, especially if you were infected with syphilis, that's sort of you know, it's not just a physical disease, but you also kind of become a bit of a pariah. And so to be able to go somewhere and you have a community of other, like there are communities of cancer patients today, and they find, you know, sharing their experiences. Do you think Hot Springs was also kind of a locus of that sort of community?
Locus. I'm not sure we'd say locus. That is a very good observation. We don't realize just how horrifying the tertiary stage of syphilis was, but people used to walk around and they would have like a gauze covering this part, because if you got to that tertiary stage, your body was being eaten up with it. It was just horrifying. But yeah, there was such a stigma to it that you have to think. I remember reading one of the reports, Dr. O.C. Winger, who was the head of the venereal disease clinic here. He was a man who was born, I think, in the 1880s, and he grew up in that era of the real patriarchy, white man's burden. And so he had his biases, and there was a white woman who was well educated. He was writing about this woman. He didn't mention what her name was, but she was from Texas, and she had come here for treatment. And he was just, it was like hard for him to imagine a white woman, educated and all that. I mean, what did that have to do with it? I mean, his brain wasn't thinking. I mean, as much as he knew about science, his own. So there's a lot mixed up in sexually transmitted diseases, and that really challenge all of us. And but that is a valid point. People didn't come here and stay in a hospital. The whole town was itself a hospital. So you had a lot of boarding houses, and people stayed for a long time. And yeah, that's, by the way, we had a national library here. So there were all kinds of things for people to do. And, but anyway,
Okay. Another question someone asks, I have ancestors who lived in Creole Springs, Illinois, moved to Eureka Springs and helped set that up. Then some went on to Hot Springs. Was there a pattern of people doing that, traveling to other springs?
Oh yes, oh yes, oh please. I mean, not just around the United States, but they would travel Europe. Lincoln's Mary Todd Lincoln, she visited the springs in some of the European countries. We were often compared later on in the early 20th century. We were often compared to Baden-Baden and some of the other great places. And we were actually set in 1916 to jump into in a big way. And then the war came along, and after that, there was never funds. And so a lot of what ifs for Hot Springs over the years. I mean, a lot of what ifs, the paths that we could have taken, and the growth in the medical community that ended up going to other places could have been here. So.
Okay, well, it looks like that is all of the questions. Any closing remarks?
No, I just, it's been a pleasure to do this. I kind of was feeling my way at the very beginning because what I am looking at when I got started is different than what I thought I'd be looking at, and it kind of threw me. This is all a learning thing for all of us, and I so appreciate that y'all allowed me to be part of it so that I could learn to do this. Public health is so important. I mean, it's and you know, I just, you know, we need to look in the past to see what was done and what worked and what didn't work, and how we allowed our feelings about certain things to cloud our judgment on what is in the best interest of everybody. And with public health, it has to be everybody pulling together on the same page. So, and I don't want to preach here, so that's all I have.
Well, we really appreciate you being here tonight. There are some people in the comments saying that this was fun and sending their thanks and appreciation for you. So,
okay.
But we really appreciate you being here, and I had a great time. And I want to tell everyone still watching that in 2 weeks from now, we'll be talking to Rachel Patton about the Boonesville, the Arkansas Tuberculosis Sanatorium in Boonesville. So I hope everyone will tune in for that. Janis Percefull, thank you again.
Thank you.
Really do appreciate it. And we'll check back with you at some point in the future.
Okay. Take care.
Okay, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.